Hey there, welcome back. This time, we're going to talk about design principles. Design principles, does that mean? Now, what is design principles? Design principles is about the visual language, basically, according to Wucius Wong, okay, to get started to understanding design principles. So far, is to understand the way we see things. So far we have been looking at um, quite a number of things, even lateral thinking to looking at synaptic triggers, looking at forms of creating new ideas. Now, what about composing these ideas? What about making a statement purely using visuals? Not just using text. What about arranging these elements on a plane or on a surface? Or how do you arrange what you want others to look at? Is there any way to do this? Is there any way to communicate using purely the elements of design or visuals and making a strong statement? Now that's composition. So composition is dependent on the principles of understanding how we see things and how we arrange things. That's why design is a very practical thing. So according to Wucius Wong, the designer is a very practical person. But before he or she is ready to tackle this practical thing, you first have to understand what is a visual language. Mastering the visual language is another thing. I wouldn't say you need to master it, but I think in order to master it, you first need to understand it. So let's get into that. Now, the mind is a pattern making system. We like to make patterns with our mind. We like to look at things, and we like to um, we like to have our own system of workflow in the way we understand how things work. Okay, the information system of the mind creates patterns and recognize them a lot. The effectiveness is one-way communication with the environment, etc., etc. It's like brushing your teeth. You know, every morning you get up, there's this one pattern that happens. It's like a routine. So our mind tends to really get comfortable with this pattern making routine. Now, unlike the spoken or written language, of which the grammatical laws are more or less established, the visual language have no obvious flaws. No obvious laws, sorry. Each design theories may have a completely different set of discoveries. Patterns are like theories too. Now, how does theories come about? Through patterns. The more reoccurrences of something, when a pattern continues to reoccur, it becomes a theory. It establishes you start to hypothesize based on a familiar reoccurrences. So remember, in critical thinking, when it becomes hypothetical, it because there's a frequency of occurrences. Now, designers tend to do that too, you know. So now, what about two-dimensional design? So two-dimensional design can affect basically your visual understanding and perception no matter where we go and what we do. So it exists because they all give us a sense of emphasis. You may have all kinds of patterns and all that, but is it possible that design principles or two-dimensional design can make us understand how to create emphasis, right? So let's have a look at that. Now, what does that mean? It means that these patterns that we're seeing, it's possible to rearrange it. When we look at visual patterns, when we look at everything that's around us, when you see familiarity, is it possible to rearrange them? Now, it doesn't have to be just 2D. You can also see things in 3D. When you rearrange something, you're trying to rearrange the emphasis of our focal point. or what you want to look at first, or what you want others to look at first, right? So visual arrangement is very important. What are visuals? Visuals. What are visuals? Let me tell you what visuals are not. They're not drawings. They're not television. They're not paintings or digital art. They're not photographs. Visuals are basically what the eye sees. Obviously, we always have a very interactive session in class about something like that, but I'm sure you get it. It's what the eye sees. Our eyes love to arrange and organize and observe and read these visuals. This is our pattern, isn't it? So we like to do that. And the human brains also think visually. We are all visual thinkers. We tend to translate whatever we have in our imagination and put them on a surface. Now, 80% of the brain is dedicated to visual processing. Remember this kid picking up the child in us? So visual thinking is not new. It's part of our history. Written language originated from basically even drawing and sketching. Now, visual patterns are there. There are constant reoccurrences. Visual patterns, and the visual language. Now, again, it becomes hypothetical when they constantly reoccur. When that happens, it becomes a design theory. It does, because a designer who tends to use the same composition, if the composition bears result, and if it's frequently used and bears similar result, then that designer have a specific theoretical approach to the design layout or the composition. So therefore, again, this is what happens. But how does our eyes do this? Now, very often we make our evaluation again by observation. Remember the test of creative thinking, that it's always done by observation. Now, in this case, when it comes to composition, this is very important. Listen very carefully. You have to observe, and you're going to have to make some overall observation, but you also observe implied lines. So there's observation, there's elements like implied lines. Implied lines are lines that are there, but you can't see it. They're like invisible arrows. Okay, and there's also visual perception. So observation, implied lines, and visual perception. Perception is like what it represents. Okay, now it's about order. Okay, it's about visual placement. When the visual placement have a very strict order and grid-like system or something like that, it's arranged really nicely. But what if it's disrupted? What if the placement moves? Something happens, it creates interest. Yeah, so it's about visual arrangement and also visual disorder, or something, you disrupt it. Yeah, so both ways are visual arrangements, both ways are also arrangement, but both ways are also significant. Now, if you look at a composition like this, what do you think is happening here? There's implied lines, and the implied lines simply mean that you see those, there are lines that's moving from, that's pointing directly to the center. They're invisible arrows that's pointing directly to the center. You can see all their little selfies. There's also eye direction. There's eye direction, there's implied lines, there's a focal point. You can see the mountain that becomes the focus, the girl in the center becomes the focus, and so on. And of course, you see the group, the three of them is grouped up by the frame of the screen, creating a strong sense of unity. So there's also perception as well. that you perceive that they are united, they are strong, and it's about where to look first and what to look at. So there's a sense of eye direction. You see the center one first, then the second one, the second one. What do you think you see first in this image? Of course, the glowing thing that's coming out of the ground. Then you see the girl. Then you see the background. So what does the eyes look at? Now the eyes look at the elements of design. It looks at the principles of design. It looks also at the perception of design, which is something that we're going to cover very soon. It's called Gestalt. Okay. Now, all of these are connected to each other. The elements, the principles, and the perception of design. So, we'll start off with the elements of design. Now, the elements of design comprises of shape, line, color, value, type, and texture. And you see lines are like, you can see that these images showing the line is about line work, okay? Renderings of lines and identifying lines emphasized composition, okay? Drawings, and there's various types of graphic work that is comprised of lines. So lines that exist in any form of visualization. Shape, more form that exist in any kind of composition, whether there's lines or whether there's a combination of elements, but you see a clear definition of shape. Okay, a shape. There's value, there's color, gradient, hue, and so on and so forth. There's form, three-dimensional, shadow, light, reflected light on the surface, etc. Then you have, of course, color, hue, tone, and so on and so forth. And there's also typography. There's typography, font, letter forms, type expression, and things like that. There's also the use of layout space and grid system. So the principles of design and the elements of design goes hand in hand. The elements of composition is important to understand how they all are connected in the overall principles of design. Now, main principles, there's support principles, and then there's Gestalt. Now you have the main principles. You can see here, figure ground, unity, variety, hierarchy, proportion. And then you have support principles, which is balance, repetition, contrast, harmony, emphasis, scale, and movement. And you got Gestalt, which is to do with perception. Yeah. Now, these days, design principles can also be realized through any sense of perception, literally translating them into three-dimensional. Now, three-dimensional thinking does help. When you see things in 3D, it has some significant connection to visual arrangement. So it's not just confined to 2D plane, but also in 3D environments. Now, when it comes to 3D environments, you can see a lot more going on here. You can see some of this sensory things that's going on here. For example, the 5 senses, seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling, because it's more tangible if it's 3D and it goes all around us. So it's related to the basic elements of design, definitely, without a doubt. Now let's get started with the principles of design. Now, in the principles of design, we're going to be going to look at some of the main principles and how the main principles and support principles can come together. Now, one of the easiest things is to evaluate a certain design composition. Now, in this case, figure ground. You notice there's some posters that do a lot of emphasis on positive and negative space. Now in figure ground, we're looking at the foreground, which is a shape, or the foreground is a color. But if there are two colors involved, it's easy to manipulate, to use the background color as a shape and the foreground color also as a shape, and how they work together to form a visual. Now here, figure ground, you can see that you can play around and manipulate it and embed information very cleverly. If you look at for example, like Spider-Man, if he's Spider-Man, you can see the blue forming or creating a form of the Spider-Man. You see Elvis Presley, seeing how Coca-Cola is very much emphasized through his sideburns. And you see unity. Unity also is a design principle, one of the main principle, or just in Gestalt as well, because it's to do with convergence. All these implied lines pointing to the center. This to do with more symmetrical layout, symmetrical composition, and more focal point. Variety is to do with chaos, because it's going everywhere, but there's no specific focus, where everything else is all over there, but creating a strong sense of unity as well. Yeah. Repetition is to do with repeated designs that are repeating by itself, but they can be similar objects, or can be similar objects or dissimilar objects, but repeated in a very clever way. This is not a good example of similar objects yet dissimilar. I mean, similar and dissimilar objects, but repeated. There's also contrast to see how figure ground contrast can also reoccur here. Contrast between shadow and light, contrast between images and shape, and so on and so forth. So there's all kinds of contrast versions that you can see, and analogical contrast, metaphorical contrast, and so on and so forth. You can see harmony, rhythm, flow here, how everything is arranged harmoniously. Now harmony is very interesting to observe, especially when things are not related to each other, are somehow harmoniously coexisting together, and that's a sense of harmony. Okay, and there's a flow as well. There's a sense of a rhythm to how they're arranged, so you can see consistency. Now I'm also going to show you a little bit of this. These are concept layouts where you show that you actually sketch like shapes to imply a sense of layout concepts. So by understanding this, you're understanding the relationship between the shape and the space. Okay, so white space and objects. So when you do concept layouts like this, you understand, like, okay, in terms of what you want to focus, first is the larger circle, then you have the smaller circles as secondary observation. So your eye direction moves from here on to end to others. So same thing with this. So now the dominant shape is, of course, the Elvis one, and secondary ones towards the left. You would see this one first, and you can see implied line where the glasses are also looking towards the main product that's been advertised, which is a very clever design. Yeah. Balance is about symmetrical, or two equal weight, or it could be somewhat asymmetrical yet balanced at the same time, something like this. You can see layouts like this that shows a lot of balance. This is the easiest way to show you what composition might mean, but you should make your own observation. I mean, look at even 3D environments. Okay, hierarchy is to do with what's more important and what's least important. Yeah, so you can see hierarchy is pretty much everywhere, because you always have to see headlines playing the lead role in most graphic design layout or book covers or magazine covers. So you can see how they go from top down, yeah. And you can see even for image, it can be a foreshortening effect like this. It could very well be a large product right in front of you, okay, and so on and so forth. It could be size, a form of magnification. That's probably the object, or maybe a type form or a letter form. Man, there's just so much to explore, isn't it? Convergence, chaos, implosion, dominance. I don't know. You can be the type of person that can think of different kinds of concept layouts, and you can hypothesize or come up with your own theory as well. Convergence, chaos, and implosion, etc. You can see this happening. There are layouts, poster layouts, and design layouts that looks pretty much like this, which is incredible, right? There's no specific focus, but somewhat strong unity, but everything converging, or sometimes moving out. Now, when it comes to Gestalt, you can see the Gestalt principles for figure ground, closure, proximity, similarity, continuity, and alignment. Now, in here, Gestalt. Now we're probably going to talk a lot more about Gestalt later on, but let me just go through this with you. Figure ground. When it comes to figure ground, Gestalt is to do with perceiving what and manipulating what positive space like this. The E becomes a foreground and the white becomes a background. So that's called a positive space. Now, positive space is the E, is the highlight, has the hue, that has the shape. Okay, that's defined. The shape is clearly defined with a color, and white here is obviously perceived as a background to support the E, because without the white you can't see the E. So that's the whole thing, is perceiving this. We are perceiving white to be an object, a thing that supports the E, a thing that celebrates the shape of the E. Celebrates. Now, what if you increase the E? The E's color dominates the entire space, and it becomes a reverse. This is called negative space, and by in Gestalt you can see if it reverses, then the same thing, the same principle occurs. The E has to be supported with the background. Now the background can be reversed. The shape of the color of the E can dominate the entire background, and the E becomes the white instead. So, for example, S is an obvious shape, okay? And what if you put the S and overlap it together? You can see the S becomes a little bit more ambiguous, but somehow the background still supports the shape of the ambiguous S. You don't know what that shape becomes, but how do you know there's ambiguity in the shape of the S? Therefore, you can still visibly see it as supported by the background. Now, what if you continuously add more, overlap the S, or just add more of the black, and continuously layer it with the black, and trying to perceive that's the more of the white. You can see an overlap, but you can tell that there is something going on right here. You can see the shape of the S and the shape of the white has some form of relationship. So this is a manipulation of figure ground in Gestalt, where you can create this figure ground ambiguity, manipulate with the ambiguity to create some form of statement itself. So it's a real manipulation of background and foreground and positive and negative space. What about texture, form, value, and color? So we're going to talk about texture, form, value, color in the next chapter of this, and there's so much more texture to. We're going to do probably some kind of exercise a little bit. Who knows? Maybe a class exercise, maybe some kind of exploration, maybe another visual journal task. Maybe there's something in the side quest that you can explore. But nevertheless, I'll see you again. You take care, and I'll see you in class.